Hi, everybody. Welcome to the night lab tutorial for the Anything for Selena Social Justice Bus Tour. We're almost there to the finish line. So if you're really following these videos, just make sure that you have this information or you have your own information already added to them so you can submit it, so you can get onto the bus and you don't have to worry about pricing or anything like that, right? So let's move forward into this. And today we're going to do one of the other slides, right? I think it's slide 5 in all of it. So let me share my screen real quick and let's see if we can get started on it, right? So if you're looking at this, this is the Night Lab website. Of course, we're going to go to story maps. Again, story maps are pretty easy to use. When we start looking at all the different types of projects that it actually has, it's just right there. It's one of the first ones they had as available to this. Now, when we go into story maps, of course, it's really easy to log in. You just need a Google account. As soon as you get your Google account, you're going to be able to log in. And of course, like we have in all these other videos, I already have it ready for you. We're just going to kind of go over this next court case. So it's not four, it's like five or six. I mean, last time we went over Clifton versus Fuente, right? This is where we see in the movie where they're explaining what it means to be Mexican American and American at the same time. And then we're going to switch over to this other court case. And this other court case is very interesting because it's also dealing with kind of the same thing of belonging and acceptance into the United States, but also through this kind of other avenue that we see. This is the TERRELL versus Rodriguez or Rodriguez versus TERRELL pool case. And what we're going to see here in this location specifically, this is right next to McCullum High School on the south side of San Antonio. Might as well be in the parking lot, but it's really across the street. And in this court case, civil rights leaders, Mexican American civil rights leaders, petitioned the pool to be open to Mexican Americans under the Good Neighbor policy and the Caucasian race resolution, but the owner refused their entrance. And although not technically in the movie, it is important civil rights court case. It is also part of the same neighborhood as the Puente case too, as well. This is the neighborhood that Thurman Barrett owned on the south side of San Antonio, which was one of the most segregated parts of San Antonio at that point in time in the 1920s and 1930s. Um, Probably one of the most segregated parts in the state, just judging by the size of San Antonio and the size of this neighborhood. And if you don't know a lot about this court case, let's go into it. Of course, Terrell is a pool. It's a leisure spot for a lot of incoming people from across the country, but it's based on the South Side. And what we already know by the South Side, especially in the Clifton versus Fuente case, is that this is where Mexican Americans are trying to move into, but this is also where they're trying to actually gain some rights into these other avenues, like just going to a simple pool, right? Now, this pool at this point in time, it belongs to a private corporation, as you see in the actual documents, the legal documents right here. But nonetheless, they're trying to gain acceptance into it. And when we look into this court case, we really have to go into the good neighbor policy and the Caucasian race resolution, because they really quote it in the actual court case. And the court case is going to tell them, like, no, the Caucasian race resolution is an executive proclamation by the governor, and it's really not connected to this foreign policy that you were talking about. The foreign policy is the Good Neighbor policy. This is during World War II. And the Good Neighbor policy is very unique too, as well, because the United States is trying to show some type of connection between the United States and Latin American countries. And because of this, the United States doesn't want these Latin American countries like Mexico to actually side with the Nazis or the Japanese at this point in time. So the United States tries to ease all these tensions between the Latin American countries and the United States. Obviously, if you know anything about U.S. history and its foreign policy with Latin America, there has been a lot of stuff dealing with this process, mainly because the United States has continuously been the aggressor when dealing with Latin American countries. We can really go all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine. And if you don't know anything about the Monroe Doctrine, it's a very interesting piece of legislation by James Monroe. We actually see that Trump tried to use this recently too, as well, citing the Monroe Doctrine that the United States is literally going to protect all of the Western Hemisphere. Basically, this is where Latin America, the United States, and Canada are the Western Hemisphere. And it's going to try to establish non-colonization, non-intervention tactics in these areas by European countries. Now, what we also know is that the United States is going to intervene, colonize, and really commit their own type of colonization in these parts. And so the good neighbor policy mixed in with what happened in the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s kind of creates this interesting mix of what's going to happen in the next 100 years. You can actually look up some of these clippings from these political cartoons of the Monroe Doctrine. Obviously, that's Uncle Sam. These are supposed to represent Europeans, but the Western Hemisphere, of course, is this whole sphere of influence for the United States either way. Now, when we also get into what's really happening with the Good Neighbor policy, we have to know that this is the time of World War II, and the Good Neighbor policy is a very unique part because what we start seeing with it is actually multiple different civil rights activists in the United States, specifically in Texas, are really looking at this policy to help them out, right? And to help end segregation in this part of the United States. And you can see this through all the different organizations that are going to form, the different legislations that are going to form, the different types of acts that are going to form. And so, even in the United States, we start seeing that the good neighbor policy is going to not only influence what's happening across in these Latin American countries, but it's also going to influence some of these states and enters this good neighbor commission in Texas. Sorry about that. The Good Neighbor Commission in Texas, right? Established by this guy, Coke Stevens. He's the governor of Texas at this point in time. State agency designed to improve relations with Mexico, address discrimination for Mexican Americans, and tackle labor, health, and housing issues for migrants, and it's really immigrants at this point in time. It also promotes inter-American relations. And so inside this Good Neighbor Commission, which is really named after the Good Neighbor policy, we also start seeing why he's advocating for this new commission to be formed in Texas specifically. Why? Because it goes down to the Bracero program, right? And the Bracero program is this bilateral agreement between the United States and Mexico to allow Mexican farm workers to actually enter the United States and work on agricultural labor departments like the railroad factories during World War II. And this is very different from the United States and what they did to Mexican Americans actually during the Great Depression, which is just like 10 years prior, or maybe like just 5 years too, or 2 years at this point. And what they did for Mexican Americans is actually repatriate them back to Mexico, where there's this whole deportation initiative by the United States, states, and local actors to actually deport and remove Mexican Americans from the United States because they also saw them as a problem of stating that because the Great Depression is targeting the economy, the people that are actually working the economy, that are taking jobs away from true Americans, are these Mexican American groups, right? And we start really seeing that even during the Great Depression, we start seeing this language actually being formed in the redlining maps of redlining. Oh my gosh, redlining maps of San Antonio, and it really states this because this is during the time of the Great Depression, how this is really being enacted right here. And when we look at the categories, we look at the population, we look at the space, we start seeing some of this language start being formed right here. Let me see if I can go a little further in. We start seeing this language being formed right here, specifically in these neighborhoods where we see the majority of Mexican Americans actually residing into. And these areas are very interesting because they kind of pop up all over the place, especially amongst the Southwest. What you already know is that by the early 1900s, really in 1910s, 1920s, we see this massive immigration of Mexican Americans, or Mexicans, sorry, enter the United States because of the Mexican Revolution. And because of that, the population of this area of the Southwest is just booming. But what we also see is that during the Great Depression, these are also the targeted communities because they are in such high clusters of segregated areas. Now, when we look at the redlining maps, it really doesn't show this, and you really have to look at the context of what's happening here across the realm of the United States, but also what's happening here in some of these areas. Because in these areas, this is where we're starting to see how segregation is going to form, what it's going to look like, and what it's really going to say about these about this space. And in San Antonio, what we're looking at here is actually this other area right here, south of south of downtown into this area called Harlandale, right? And you can kind of see it right here because we also looked at Mayfield, where the actual scene where are you Mexican? Are you more, you have to be more Mexican than Mexican, more American than American scene in the Selena movie. It's actually based literally right here on Somerset Road. Now we're going to go on to the opposite way where we're looking at this other area of the South Side, really over here by Hutchins area right here. And this is where McCullum High School is at. And Terrell Middle School, it's actually a middle school named after this spot, is actually not the home site of where Terrawell's pool's at. The Terrawell pool is actually going to be up here, right here next, in between like the district police department and this area right here, and then kind of move over here. And what we start really seeing with this is that over time, these things start adding up. Segregation in San Antonio, the Bracero program's coming up, the Good Neighbor Commission's coming about. These kind of go back to the United States and its stance on Latin America. We already know that the United States already invaded Mexico in the 1840s, leading to the U.S. war with Mexico and leading to the Treaty of Hidalgo, right, by 1848. So the United States has had this historic, really historic um, treaty, or really historic like antagonism against Mexico and Mexicans in the United States. And that doesn't even go into Texas Revolution and how that feels amongst Anglo Americans that are coming in against Mexicans. It's a whole hodgepodge of this. Now we're going to go back to the Bracero program because we need to know how the Bracero program is really going to be enacted and during this time in Texas. And what we know is that Mexico is not wanting its braceros, its Mexican citizens, to go to Texas specifically. Why? Because there's so much documented racism in Texas and so many documentations of Mexicans literally just being unalived, right? For lack of a better term, right? They're being killed in these spaces. And I recommend you actually reading up on the Texas Rangers and how that really is affecting this kind of time period in the United States against Mexicans, specifically in Texas. And enters this book, right? Refusing. Oh my goodness, I can't spell. Refusing to forget, right? You can look up the website. It's a really interesting website where they do document some of these places. But this does talk about the targeted state-sanctioned violence against Mexican Americans during this time period. Now, you can also look at the book itself, though. The book is a really great book. Let me see if I can find it right here. Oh, no, that's not it right there. Yeah, I can't find it. Let me see if I can get it over here. Yeah, can't find it. But I recommend looking at this website because it's also going to give you some other resources to look at too as well. This is a very unique time period for Texas and Mexican Americans, and we have to kind of see it as that. And so when we look at what's happening in state-sanctioned violence in Texas, and we look at state-sanctioned violence against specifically Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Texas, we have to look at why Coke Stevens is going to implement this thing called the Caucasian. Oh my gosh, I can't do. I can't type right now. I'm so sorry. The Caucasian Race Resolution, and it's an actual resolution instilled by a Texas governor. And what it says basically in this resolution is that it declared that all persons of Caucasian descent, specifically including Mexican Americans, were entitled to equal public accommodations aimed at aligning with the Good Neighbor policy. It's such a random piece of Texas law that it's so unique for this time period that we just have to dissect this, especially when we're looking at the Terrells, because Mexican American civil rights activists are literally doing this right there, right in the forefront. Now, when we go all the way back to the Truly Hidalgo, there is a very specific clause in the treaty. So let's just look at this. I mean, oh my gosh. So when we look at the articles within the document, is a very unique one. There's a couple of documents in here, goes all the way, or sorry, a couple of articles in here, goes all the way up to Article 23. So we just gotta look up citizenship. And what's really interesting about citizenship is that at this point in time, Mexicans are going to have the option of choosing or acquiring the citizenship of the United States. So, because the border is moving on Mexicans living in the north end of Mexico, these Mexican individuals are able to declare themselves either Mexican citizens or U.S. citizens, as we see in this article right here, right? And then within this article, we really start understanding how this is going to shape up because legally, the only people that could be considered U.S. citizens at that point in time could only be white men of good character. Now, that being said, because this is automatically going to naturalize a whole section of a part of the United States now, in the United States, these Mexican citizens can declare U.S. citizenship, which would legally declare them as legally white. Now, we already know how this is going to go out and how this is going to come about because even though you're legally white, you're racially non-white, right? And because of that, second class citizenship for Mexican Americans looks very different, especially from the African American experience in the United States. And enters this court case that really is defining what this really means, at least in the 1940s in the United States, because this court case is really going to argue about with Caucasian race. It's going to argue looking at the good neighbor policy. It's going to argue with these concepts that had very predated this time period all the way 100 years before, literally in 1848, right? And so when we look at this type of court case, we have to realize that this brings up a broader spectrum of different things that are happening. And because of the Caucasian Race Act or resolution, we start seeing that Mexico is going to allow braceros to enter Texas. However, Texas also is going to monitor this with the Good Neighbor Commission too as well. So when we start looking at the dates, right, this is happening in 1943, the same time the Good Neighbor Commission is actually happening too, right? Both being instilled by the same governor. And so what we're looking at here is really this kind of global perspective of how it's going to reach the south side of San Antonio. And it's happening in these two court cases. When we look at the ending for Salinas Social Justice Bus Tour, it's happening in Clifton versus Puente and Rodriguez versus TERRELL's swimming pool case, right? Like it's happening in these two spots. And those two spots are very interesting because they're both in the south side of San Antonio. Like, look, one's right here, and then the other one is just on the other side of San Antonio. And the reason why really like looking at these spaces becomes very interesting is that this is a kind of away from the segregated part of San Antonio that's the west side. And not to say anything against the west side, but what we're also looking at is what's happening with Mexican Americans. Why are they wanting to leave the west side? Mainly because it's segregated too, right? Highly congested, contentious areas in this part of town that are historically segregated. But what we also see at this point in time is that during World War II, the rise of this Mexican American middle class is going to rise up, literally because of the defense industry, returning soldiers, and these civil rights organizations are going to pop up, right? Like LULAC's going to have so many court cases involved in this. Civil rights leaders are going to have so many. And then we also get the creation of the American GI Forum, right? Later on, these are also going to help influence some of the later civil rights court cases, but these were the precursors to that 20 years before. And they're using foreign policy to try to end segregation. And for me, I always thought that was just very unique because how do you define that? Well, it's all through all these different steps, and all these lawyers are going through these different steps in order to make sure that the court case understands this. Now, at the end of the day, the court case is really going not going to grant Rodriguez entrance into this because of the Caucasian race resolution, stating that it's really more of a state in action thing, and it's really not a federally mandated thing too as well. And so what we start seeing is that this is going to play against them. But it's a really fundamental court case that's actually going to actually move the needle a little bit towards more ending segregation for Mexican Americans. And this court case and Clifton versus Wenther are both going to be used for the Hernandez versus Texas court case later on, which declares Mexican Americans as a Class A part. So when we look at this right here, this real location on the south side of San Antonio, right, means something else. It really does mean something else. It's not just a random court case that you wouldn't hear about unless you took a history class. It's really a court case that's going to influence so many steps moving forward. And we really want to see how this influenced the rest of San Antonio. And this is one of the reasons why we're really taking people across the city of San Antonio, because there's more history than people think about outside of downtown area. Downtown's a great space, love it. But there's also so much history and so many battles fought outside of it because of segregation in San Antonio. Whether it's leaving segregation and entering a segregated space, or whether it's entering a segregated space that has historically been segregated since before the United States, really. And this is a very interesting mix, right? I wish we would go over all these spaces because I think it's very important. This is why we're doing these tutorials. So if you have any information about this, any other thing that you want to add, go for it. Please do so because I think it's really cool. One thing that we did learn about this court case, actually, and we did learn about um, the Rodriguez case and really like Harlandale area, is that we also know that the person who killed Selena actually went to Harlandale High School, right? So who killed Selena, right? And it's Yolanda Sandoval. And then if you look up, where did she go to high school? You're gonna see that she attended many different spaces, but you're also gonna see that she was also really involved in kind of like this kind of mixture of this. She, in San Antonio Express News, she graduated in 1979, a graduate of McCullum High School. McCullum High School is actually right here next to the court case. This is McCullum High School right here. So call it coincidence, call it just very unique. Either way, we're gonna go be looking at that spot, and when we look at that spot, I really want us to take in this space because it means so many different things on so many different levels for so many different people. And really, that's really what it's all about in this space, in this bus tour, is that we just really need to collectively understand how San Antonio is changing civil rights, how San Antonio, its neighborhoods are shaping people and what's really happening to these spaces, right? So thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us again. As usual, I'll post this online. But again, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great day. Um, have have a nice one, and I'll see you around. We're going to email y'all more information moving forward because I believe you also have to sign some information, and hopefully we can get that done really quickly and smoothly for everybody. Thank you so much for your time.